to thank the director of MEMO, the staff members, the board of trustees, both of MEMO as well as the annual Palestinian Awards. Of course, the judges who have had this unenviable task of putting together the shortlist from all these wonderful books, but even worse, deciding on a winner. And last evening, Eugene mentioned that actually all the books are winners. And I concur, having read not all of them, and certainly not the 40, but the shortlisted books, and I can attest to that. Of course, one has to thank the authors and those authors who are here for allowing us to read these poignant renditions, these fascinating lives, often vignettes, but nonetheless fascinating lives, but also the rigorous scholarship that many of the books encompass. I think we need to thank you as well for supporting this crucial, critical annual event. I think it's 6 years, and I hope that this will continue for much, much longer. There are many people behind the scenes and sometimes not behind the scenes who make events like this what they are. And I just want to single out Victoria Britton because she's a legend even amongst the South Africans. Those South Africans who were in exile can attest to her generosity. And I think that Susan Daraj's book, A Curious Land, the epigram she chose for that book, a quote from W.E.B. Du Bois, could well have been used for most of the books. And I would like to quote that. Du Bois said that, "How curious a land is this, how full of untold story, of tragedy and laughter, and the rich legacy of human life, shadowed with a tragic past and big with future promise." Yassir Suleiman's book, Being Palestinian, evocatively captures in his prologue to the book what he calls another strand of identity, consisting of material culture, the binding force of food with all its textures and aromas. He mentions knafe, maklube, tabbouleh, etc. Excuse the pronunciations. I've tasted the food though, and I've smelt the aromas, and I'm familiar with the textures. The trees, the olive trees, orange trees, fig trees, the embroidery, some of which we see here, the landscapes, and also the cultural forms such as music, poetry, dance, and especially dabke, which he says, and I quote, "emerges as a form of tactile encounter with Palestine as a point of reference. The taste buds, it engages the eyes and the ears in the same way as food engages the taste buds, and spring blossoms engages our sense of smell. In spite of all the pain and suffering that are the integral part of being Palestinian, Palestine," he says, "remains an object of love." But as some of the books show, the Palestinian struggle, the catalogue of lived experiences, even before the Nakba and beyond the Naksa, does not only exert a visceral tug on many around the world, Palestinian and non-Palestinian alike. So a cold reading of imperialism shows that apartheid Israel is needed as a fundamentalist, militarized warrior state, not only to quell the unbowed Palestinians, but also as a rapid response font of reaction in concert with despotic Arab regimes to do the empire's bidding, not just in the Middle East, but also beyond. And some of us in other parts of the world can attest to this. Over the years, the role of Israel has included support for the mass terror waged against the people of Central America and South America, and facilitated the evasion of international sanctions against the apartheid regime in South Africa. And throughout the apartheid years in South Africa, there were individuals and groups who identified and stood in solidarity with the Palestinian people struggle for freedom. South Africans struggling against apartheid policies and realities were amused when the then apartheid Prime Minister Hendrik Verwoerd, many saw him as the architect of apartheid, when he stated in 1961, Israel, like South Africa, is an apartheid state. In 1976, a watershed moment in the resistance against apartheid, the Prime Minister of John Foster was invited to Israel and received with open arms by the likes of Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres. And of course, many of you know that in 1976, hundreds of school children were mowed down, starting from the streets of Soweto, but elsewhere in the country as well. But the links between these two countries go back much further. Weizmann, a close friend of General Jan Smuts, was the South African delegate to the British War Cabinet and Premier of South Africa at that time, and he was a passionate supporter of the Balfour Declaration. In addition to identifying with the struggle of Palestinians, South Africans recognized that Israel was playing a role in their own oppression. For instance, Israel was an important arms supplier to South Africa despite the international arms embargo, and as late as 1980, 35% of Israel's arms exports were destined for South Africa. Israel was loyal to the racist state and clung to the friendship when almost all other countries' relationship with South Africa dissolved. And during the 1970s, this affiliation extended into the field of nuclear weaponry, when Israeli experts helped South Africa develop at least 6 nuclear warheads. And in 1981, the South African military made history by being the first ever to use Israeli drone, as way back as 1981, drone technology against SWAPO, South African People's Organization's bases in Angola. And in the 1980s, when the global anti-apartheid movement had forced many states to impose sanctions on the apartheid regime, Israel imported South African goods and re-exported them to the world in a form of inter-racist solidarity. Israeli companies subsidized by the South African regime, despite the pittance they paid workers, were established in a number of Bantustans. But today, besides providing a ready supply of personnel and equipment to terrorize whole populations, Israel also trains police forces and military personnel around the world, lending its expertise of collective punishment, pacification, and terror. For instance, at least 2 of the 4 law enforcement agencies that were deployed in Ferguson, Missouri, after the killing of 18-year-old Michael Brown in August 2014, the St. Louis County Police Department and the St. Louis Police Department had received training from Israeli security forces in recent years. Now, I say this, and I can give you many more examples if I had more time, is that we have to recognize that the Israeli economy was founded on the special political and military role that Zionism then and today fulfills for Western imperialism, while playing its role to ensure that the region was safe for oil companies and, of course, various royal families. Today, Israel has carved out a niche market producing high-tech security essential to the day-to-day functioning of corporate globalization. The weaponry and technology of the Israeli military-industrial complex, which it exports around the world, are field-tested on the bodies of Palestinian men, women, and children. And so I was very glad that the judges shortlisted Jeff Halper's book, War on Against the People. Jeff Halper describes Israel's role in what he calls the global pacification industry. And he makes the very important point that the occupation, and I quote, represents a resource for Israel in two senses. Economically, it provides a testing ground for the development of weapons, security systems, models of population control, and tactics without which Israel would be unable to compete in the international arms and security markets. But no less important, he says, being a major military power serving other militaries and security services the world over lends Israel an international status amongst the global hegemons it would not have otherwise. Now, the important point I want to talk about here is that in the solidarity movement, we are confronted with a number of arguments, one of which is the whataboutery argument. And I think we need to revisit that. When we, in our attempts to isolate the erstwhile apartheid regime, we were confronted with responses by apartheid apologists that often ended with diversionary questions such as, what about Pol Pot at the same time as the apartheid regime? What about Idi Amin? Once again, supporters of Israel, and unfortunately, even well-meaning liberals, voiced similar sentiments, including the indignant cousin of the whataboutery argument, the complaint, why single out Israel? I think Ilan Pape put it most succinctly when he said, there are horrific cases where dehumanization has reaped unimaginable horrors. But there is a crucial difference between these cases and Israel's brutality. The former are condemned as barbarous and inhuman worldwide, while those committed by Israel are still publicly licensed and approved by Western governments. And now I want to come to another of the shortlisted books. It does not make the situation in countries like Syria any less terrible. And as an aside, the examples given in Anahid's book are a stark reminder of the horror, the unimaginable horror that Ilan Pape talks about. And I'm thinking particularly of the two examples she gives at the beginning of the book, that of Khalid Bakrami and Hassan Hassan, both tortured and killed in 2013, both in their 20s. But coming back to the point I was making is that the supporters of Israel miss the key issue. The Israeli regime is, of course, not the only one worthy of opprobrium and censure. But in the past, it would have been absurd and foolhardy to have a boycott, divestment, sanctions strategy against the genocidal and isolationist Pol Pot regime, or today against the horrific Boko Haram or Daesh. It is a particular tactic chosen because of its potential effectiveness in a particular situation. And as the sorely missed writer and journalist Mike Marquisi explains, arguing that one should ignore the specific call for BDS against Israel because it is not simultaneously aimed at all oppressive regimes, is like arguing you should cross a picket line because the union in dispute is not simultaneously picketing all other employers. So the demand of the campaign to isolate Israel is not that Israel should be better than other countries, but that it should adhere to the very modest minimum standards of human rights and international law. It is an attempt to end the impunity given to Israel. In fact, Israel is singled out by Western powers for special treatment. And the material support the Israeli state has received has not tempered its crimes, but has instead made it more vicious. It should be seen in all its nakedness as a pariah state like Israel's dear and unlamented former friend, apartheid South Africa. Now, for close to 70 years, Palestinians have alerted us to one outrage after another. Injustices piled upon injustices, without the commensurate scale of global solidarity required to make a difference in the lives of Palestinians. The periodic mass slaughter of Palestinians, including about, 10 long years of a medieval-like siege of Gaza, adds to the urgency of political action. It should be viewed together with the ongoing theft of Palestinian land in the West Bank, Jerusalem, and the Naqab, the discrimination against Palestinians in Israel, the misery of millions of Palestinian refugees. And of course, we all know that the Israeli state is not interested in a just peace, but rather the pacification or ethnic cleansing, or as many increasingly conclude, using the UN definition, the genocide of Palestinians. And there was a fascinating piece written by Karma Nabulsi way back in 2007, I think, which talks about the tarnished trickery of those who talk about the peace process. And I think this is a very useful quote, because through that I'm going to segue into the other books that were shortlisted. Karma says that more worrying than the acquiescence of our political leaders is the intense defeatism now pervading the mainstream media. They too are apparently too exhausted to inform their readers of the shocking reality in occupied Palestine and the refugee camps. Yes, Karma says, there are tired politicians without valor who are holding the reins of power. And there has never been a more visible rupture between governments and ordinary citizens than we witness today. 2007, but today as well, even more so today. But it also reveals a more hopeful reality. Ordinary citizens all over the world have not given up on the Palestinians, and the Palestinians have not given up on themselves, close quotes. And we see in these shortlisted books, and I'm sure many that were not shortlisted, the memories, the reflections of real people, not statistics, and what matters to the Palestinian people, not nameless people rendered invisible by major events that Shireen Sikali's book, Man of Capital, speaks to, or the Orientalist oversimplifications that Lorenzo Kamel's book, Imperial Perceptions of Palestine, deals with so wonderfully, admirably. But the context, the challenges towards the myths and the caricatures are all part of the resistance. And Haifa mentioned this to me in the beginning of this evening, that this is part of the resistance. This cultural production is essential for self-determination of Palestine, and this cultural production that takes place not just in Palestine, but in the diaspora, or as Yasser would prefer, the areas of the dispersed. And in the words of a wonderful South African poet, this is where memory also becomes a weapon. The other issue I wanted to talk about, besides the whataboutery argument, is the issue of Bantustanization. The Palestinian solidarity movements in South Africa as elsewhere are confronted constantly with the mantra of the two-state denouement, which allows actually various politicians to conveniently portray themselves as even-handed in their call for two states, for two people living side by side, without, of course, interrogating the nature of this Palestinian state on offer, or questioning the Israeli state's deliberately stalling as it steals ever more land. And Zionism has used this two-state facade while reserving for itself the intention of total theft or expropriation. So the two-state notion essentially is a code word for the maintenance of the status quo for the Israeli ruling class. And today, in a post-Trump world, they don't even bother with that pretense. Joel Covell, wonderful writer, some time ago wrote that more than half a century of chewing and gnawing away at Palestinian land has left the latter more of a rag doll on a stick than the framework for a living organism. Down to some 8% of the original territory, laced with Jews-only roads and peppered with hundreds of settlements that arrogate the water and resources, a dumping ground for Israeli waste, its fields and olive trees destroyed, its land carved up by the apartheid wall. Thank you. The potential Palestinian state is more than a bad joke. In the South African version of the Bantustan, there was at least some coherence. The apartheid regime, despite its racial imagination, wanted the Bantustans to be viable and actually built hospitals, schools, and colleges. For the apartheid rulers in Israel, there is no such pretense. Rather, the unrestrained zeal to destroy any potential, any capacity to be viable. And during the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, the one state, many states conundrum and the return of the refugees were not the main issue, but it is certainly the central issue relevant for the Palestinian struggle. And in terms of the right of return for the refugees, many of the books speak to this. I mentioned Anahid's Al-Hadan's book, but there's Yasir Suleiman's book, and Suzanne Daraj's book also speak to this. Anahid's book, of course, it's a path-breaking scholarly study, and it reminds us that while the memory of the Nakba is firmly implanted in the minds of generations, there are also the catastrophes of today and every other day. I have about 4 minutes, so I won't be much longer, but I need to say something about Palestinian solidarity in South Africa, which remains strong. Not too long ago, in 2014, there were about 150 to 200,000 South Africans who marched in the streets of Cape Town against the atrocities in Gaza. Almost as big as the march we had when Madiba, Nelson Mandela, was released from prison. It was a march also against full sanctions against Israel. It was the biggest march in our history. It's a continuation of intense solidarity. There are many highlights of these activities over the years. A 10,000 strong march in Durban during the UN World Conference Against Racism in 2001, where I first met the director of MEMO, Dawood Abdullah. It was a veritable festival of solidarity between different oppressed people from throughout the world. The World Summit on Sustainable Development in 2002, where the late Israeli President Shimon Peres was, and where I was arrested and put into the same prison I was put in during the struggle against apartheid, which says a lot. And of course, we've had, during Israel's Operation Cast-led assault on Gaza, trade unionists refusing to offload an Israeli ship in 2009 in the harbor of Durban. Our university, the Senate, for the first time of any university, the University of Johannesburg, severed links with Ben Gurion University, and I can continue. But I need to make the point that despite the ANC support for a sanctions campaign against apartheid South Africa, the post-apartheid South African government has facilitated increasing trade with Israel since 1994. It's an inconvenient and an unpleasant truth. In a response to the overwhelming sentiment of South Africans to expel the Israeli ambassador during the last outrage in Gaza, our Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa said, "It's often best when you want to solve problems to remain engaged so that you can have some leverage." For many of us, unfortunately, this was a variation on the constructive engagement espoused by the likes of Thatcher and Reagan. Activists have criticized the South African government's way of having it both ways, of providing a seemingly rhetorical support response to the groundswell of clamor to condemn Israel's violation of Palestinian rights and sever all ties with Israel, while keeping open the avenues of trade that are seen to benefit, really, the South African elite. And many of us are simply fed up with this empty posturing and what we perceive as lucre trumping principle. But despite this, for South Africans, as for many others, support for Palestinian liberation is now the emblematic solidarity movement of our time, as the struggle of the Vietnamese people and of the peoples of Southern Africa once was. And I want to end this talk with a poem which for me captures the internationalism, but also one of the panelists remarked last night that a strong sense of fighting injustice is quintessentially Palestinian. And for me, this poem, some of the poems Jihan read out, last night. I hope this wasn't the poem she chose for this evening. But the poem's name is My Name is Herman Wallace. Herman Wallace, of course, was a member of the Angola 3. Just want to read the poem, won't be long. Angola 3, and of course, it's a prison in Louisiana, and in fact, it's named after a former slave plantation of slaves who were brought from Angola. And this prison, Herman Wallace spent 41 years in solitary confinement. He died a few days after he was released, and his final words was, I am free. So Ramzi Baroud's poem reads, I am a black Palestinian, South African, Vietnamese. My name is Mohammed Fatima Wallace Mandela Dura King. Resistance is my creed. Prophets found their sanctity when they were shot on my soil by Israeli bullets in the Battle of Din Bin Phu. And just when you think I am defeated, my fist will rise from the charred earth in a painting by Naji Ali, through the thick walls of Louisiana State Penitentiary, in the streets of Hanoi, amid the rubble of a Gaza mosque. Even on my dying bed, I speak many tongues and have many names, but my face is always my face. On my forehead stitched the memory of pain, and I smile still and teach my son to never hate, because hate is not love, and love is freedom. I am Palestinian. My name is Herman Wallace, and I will always die free. Thank you very much.